The very first threads of Spartan history, woven into the fabric of the Peloponnesian landscape, begin not with the disciplined phalanx or the stern Lycurgan laws, but in the hazy mists of myth and the long shadows of the Greek Dark Ages. It was here, in the fertile valley of the Eurotas River, nestled between the towering peaks of Taygetus and Parnon, that a unique society would slowly coalesce, distinct from its Aegean neighbours. Imagine, if you will, a time stretching back perhaps to the 12th century BCE, a period of profound upheaval following the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization. Cities that once thrived, like the legendary Mycenae itself, with its cyclopean walls and golden treasures, lay in ruins or were abandoned. The intricate palace economies vanished, literacy largely disappeared, and the vibrant trade routes that had connected the Bronze Age world faded into obscurity. This was not a sudden cataclysm, but a gradual unravelling, a centuries-long twilight where the memory of past glories lingered only in epic poems, whispered from generation to generation. It is within this fragmented landscape that the Dorians, a Greek-speaking people, are said to have migrated into the Peloponnese. While the precise nature and scale of this Dorian invasion remain a subject of scholarly debate, some historians view it as a series of gradual infiltrations rather than a single dramatic conquest. What is certain is that their arrival fundamentally reshaped the demographic and political map of the region. They brought with them new social structures, distinct dialects, and perhaps even new forms of warfare. In Laconia, the region encompassing the Eurotas Valley, these Dorians settled, eventually establishing a cluster of villages that would one day merge to form the polis, or city-state, of Sparta. The earliest settlements were likely disparate communities, perhaps even rivals. But a shared Dorian heritage and the need for collective defence against the indigenous Achaeans, who were subjugated and reduced to a subordinate status, likely fostered a sense of unity. This period, from roughly 1100 to 800 BCE, is largely unwritten, leaving archaeologists to piece together the narrative from scattered pottery fragments, simple burial sites, and the faint outlines of early dwellings. There are no grand temples or monumental inscriptions from this era, only the quiet evidence of agrarian life, slowly finding its footing amidst the ruins of a grander past. The very name Sparta itself carries echoes of this formative period. While its mythical founder is often cited as Lacedaemon, son of Zeus, who named the city after his wife, Sparta, the historical reality is far more prosaic. The name likely derives from the scattered nature of the early settlements, as Spartus in Greek can mean sown or scattered. This suggests a federation of villages rather than a single, organically grown urban centre, a characteristic that would persist throughout much of its history, as Sparta never developed the dense, monumental cityscapes of Athens or Corinth. Its power lay not in its architecture, but in its people and their unique social order. One of the most significant, yet often overlooked, aspects of early Spartan development was the subjugation of the Messenians. Messenia, a fertile plain to the west of Taygetus, was agriculturally richer than Laconia. The desire for this land and its resources led to a series of conflicts known as the Messenian Wars, traditionally dated to the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. The First Messenian War, probably occurring around 740 to 720 BCE, resulted in Sparta's conquest of much of Messenia and the reduction of its inhabitants to the status of helots. This was a crucial turning point, for it provided Sparta with the agricultural surplus necessary to support a full-time military class. But it also created a permanent, resentful underclass that would forever shape Spartan society. The Helots were not slaves in the traditional sense, as they belonged to the state rather than individual citizens, but their lives were brutally controlled, their labor exploited, and their potential for rebellion a constant, gnawing fear for the Spartan elite. The sheer scale of the Helot population, vastly outnumbering the Spartan citizens, meant that the Spartans lived in a state of perpetual vigilance. This constant threat of internal revolt, more than any external enemy, is often cited as the primary catalyst for the radical restructuring of Spartan society that occurred in the Archaic period. It fostered a deep-seated paranoia and a collective need for absolute control, leading directly to the development of the rigorous militaristic system that defines Sparta in the popular imagination. It is around this time, perhaps in the late 8th or early 7th century BCE, that the legendary figure of Lycurgus emerges. Whether Lycurgus was a real historical personage, a composite of several reformers, or a purely mythical lawgiver, is a question that historians have debated for centuries. The ancient sources, like Plutarch, attribute to him the creation of the entire Spartan constitution, the Great Retra, and the establishment of the unique social, political, and military institutions that made Sparta so distinct. He is said to have travelled widely, studying other legal systems, before returning to Sparta to implement his radical reforms, which included the communal mess halls, syssitia, the rigorous training regimen for boys, agoge, the division of land, and the emphasis on austerity and military discipline. While the precise historical details of Lycurgus's life are shrouded in legend, the reforms attributed to him undoubtedly took place over a period of time, likely evolving through various stages rather than being imposed by a single individual. The need for a cohesive, disciplined society to manage the Helot population and secure Sparta's dominance in the Peloponnese would have driven these changes. The communal upbringing, the emphasis on physical prowess, and the devaluation of material wealth were all designed to create a unified, self-sufficient warrior class, utterly dedicated to the state. Boys were taken from their families at the age of 7 to begin the agoge, a brutal training system designed to strip away individuality and instill absolute loyalty, obedience, and martial skill. They learned to endure hardship, to fight, and to live communally, forging unbreakable bonds of comradeship that would serve them on the battlefield. Girls too received physical training, though less rigorous, aimed at producing strong, healthy mothers for future Spartan warriors. This emphasis on physical fitness for both sexes was unusual in the ancient world. The Second Messenian War, likely occurring in the mid-7th century BCE, around 685 to 668 BCE, was even more traumatic for Sparta. The Messenians, aided by other Peloponnesian states, rose in a fierce rebellion that pushed Sparta to the brink. For a time, it seemed Sparta might be overwhelmed. The poet Tyrtaeus, whose martial verses encouraged the Spartans to fight bravely, provides a rare glimpse into the psychological toll of this conflict. Sparta ultimately prevailed, but the war reinforced the deep-seated fear of Helot revolt and solidified the commitment to the Lycurgan system. It demonstrated, in the most brutal way possible, the absolute necessity of their unique social structure for their very survival. By the end of the Archaic period, roughly 600 BCE, Sparta had emerged as a formidable military power, its unique social system fully entrenched. Its citizens, the homoioi, or equals, lived a life of unparalleled austerity and dedication to the state. They were forbidden from engaging in trade or crafts, their lives entirely devoted to military training and civic duty. This created a stark contrast with other Greek city-states, where commerce, philosophy, and the arts often flourished. Sparta's strength lay in its collective discipline, its unwavering focus on military excellence, and its almost fanatical devotion to the laws attributed to Lycurgus. It was a society built on a foundation of fear and control, yet it achieved a level of stability and military prowess that was the envy and at times the terror of the rest of the Greek world. The foundations were laid not in grand architectural statements, but in the rigorous training of its youth and the iron will of its citizens. If you're enjoying this, make sure to subscribe and leave in the comments the time and place you're listening from. The whispers of change began to stir in Sparta, carried on the winds from distant lands, and the growing discontent within its own borders. For generations, the city had grappled with internal strife, a precarious balance between its ruling elite and a burgeoning population of disenfranchised citizens. Land ownership was concentrated in the hands of a few, while many struggled, their voices unheard, their contributions undervalued. It was a society teetering on the brink, ripe for transformation. And then, from the mists of legend, emerged a figure whose name would forever be etched into the very stones of Sparta: Lycurgus. His existence, much like the precise details of his reforms, remains shrouded in a captivating blend of history and myth. Some accounts paint him as a real, flesh-and-blood lawgiver, journeying through distant lands, Crete, Egypt, even India, to gather wisdom before returning to reshape his homeland. Others suggest he was more of a symbolic figure, a collective memory of a series of gradual changes adopted over time, attributed to a single, unifying name. Historians still debate whether Lycurgus was a single historical individual or a legendary embodiment of Spartan ideals. Regardless of his exact nature, the reforms attributed to him, likely enacted sometime in the 8th or 7th century BCE, irrevocably altered the trajectory of Sparta, forging it into the unique and formidable power it would become. The core of the Lycurgan Reforms was a radical restructuring of Spartan society, designed to achieve absolute equality among its citizens and to dedicate every aspect of life to the collective good and military prowess. The cornerstone of this new order was the redistribution of land. Previously, wealth had been concentrated, leading to vast disparities. Lycurgus, it is said, divided all land into equal lots, assigning one to each Spartan citizen, or homoios, the equals. This bold move aimed to eliminate economic inequality, ensuring that no citizen was richer or poorer than another, thus removing the very roots of internal conflict and fostering a sense of shared purpose. Each lot was meant to provide enough sustenance for a family, freeing men from the burdens of agriculture and allowing them to dedicate themselves entirely to military training and civic duties. This radical economic equality was reinforced by an equally radical social structure. The homoioi were the full citizens, the warriors, the elite. Beneath them were the perioikoi, meaning those who dwell around, free inhabitants of surrounding towns who engaged in commerce, crafts, and agriculture. They were not citizens, held no political rights in Sparta, but were allowed to manage their own affairs and were obligated to serve in the Spartan army when called upon. And at the very bottom of this societal pyramid were the Helots, a subjugated population, likely the original inhabitants of Laconia and Messenia, reduced to serfdom. They tilled the land, providing the agricultural labor that sustained the Spartan citizens, allowing the homoioi to pursue their rigorous military training. The Helots were bound to the land, their lives a constant struggle, their numbers often vastly outnumbering their Spartan masters. This inherent tension, the constant fear of Helot rebellion, was a perpetual undercurrent in Spartan life, shaping its policies and reinforcing its militaristic ethos. The most distinctive and enduring legacy of Lycurgus, however, was the Spartan system of education, known as the agoge. This was not merely schooling, it was a lifelong process of communal upbringing, designed to forge unyielding warriors and obedient citizens. From the moment a Spartan boy was born, his life was not his own. At birth, he was presented to a council of elders who would inspect him for physical defects. If deemed weak or sickly, he was, tragically, left to die, often exposed on Mount Taygetus. This harsh practice, though abhorrent to modern sensibles, was seen as a necessary measure to ensure the strength and purity of the Spartan lineage, a stark reflection of their relentless pursuit of physical perfection. At the age of 7, boys were taken from their mothers and entered the agoge. They lived in communal barracks, organized into age groups under the strict supervision of older boys and appointed instructors. Their training was brutal and relentless. They were taught to endure hardship, hunger, and pain without complaint. Their clothing was minimal, even in winter, and they were often given insufficient food, encouraged to steal to supplement their diet, but punished severely if caught. This was not to promote thievery, but to develop cunning, resourcefulness, and the ability to survive in harsh conditions. They slept on beds of reeds, which they gathered themselves, and were forbidden from showing emotion or weakness. Discipline was absolute, enforced with unflinching severity. Their education was not academic in the conventional sense. While they learned to read and write, the emphasis was on physical prowess, military drill, and obedience. They were taught to speak concisely and directly, in the famously laconic style that gave Sparta its name. Rhetoric and elaborate speech were disdained. Brevity and clarity were prized. Music and dance were also part of their curriculum, not for artistic expression, but for their military applications, to foster rhythm, coordination, and a sense of unity in formations. Stories of Spartan heroes and their legendary deeds were recounted, instilling a deep sense of patriotism, honor, and duty to the state above all else. This rigorous training continued into adolescence. At the age of 12, the boys' training intensified further. They were given only a single cloak for the entire year, regardless of the weather. Their heads were shaved, and they were forbidden from bathing or using oils, fostering a rugged, unkempt appearance. This period culminated in the Crypteia, a secret institution that remains one of the most controversial and mysterious aspects of Spartan society. Young men, often those who had excelled in the agoge, were sent out into the countryside with only a dagger and minimal provisions. Their mission was to survive by their wits and, chillingly, to kill any helots they encountered who seemed too strong, too rebellious, or too numerous. This brutal practice served multiple purposes. It provided a final, extreme test of survival skills, instilled fear among the helots, and perhaps served as a grim form of population control, ensuring the helots remained subservient. The exact nature and extent of the Crypteia are still debated by scholars, with some arguing it was a regular, institutionalized practice, while others believe it was a more sporadic or emergency measure. At the age of 20, Spartan men became full citizens, though their military obligations continued. They were expected to marry, but still lived in communal barracks, eating their meals together in messes called syssitia. Participation in the syssitia was mandatory for every citizen, and failure to contribute a set amount of food and wine from their landlot meant forfeiture of citizenship rights. These communal meals were vital for fostering camaraderie, loyalty, and a shared identity among the warriors. It was here that they discussed military strategy, debated civic matters, and reinforced the bonds that held their society together. Even after marriage, a man would only visit his wife secretly, often at night, returning to the barracks before dawn. This practice, too, was designed to prioritize loyalty to the state and comrades over individual family ties. For Spartan women, life was remarkably different from their counterparts in other Greek city-states. While they did not participate in military training or politics, they enjoyed a degree of freedom and influence unparalleled elsewhere. Lycurgus, it is said, believed that strong mothers produced strong sons, and therefore Spartan girls also underwent a rigorous physical education. They ran, wrestled, threw the javelin and discus, often in public and with minimal clothing, much to the shock of other Greeks. This emphasis on physical fitness was not for warfare, but for childbearing, to ensure they produced healthy, robust offspring for the state. Spartan women were also educated, though not in the same military sense as the boys. They managed their households, oversaw the helot labourers, and held significant economic power, often inheriting and owning land. Indeed, by the 4th century BCE, Spartan women owned a substantial portion, perhaps even up to 40% of all land in Sparta, a truly extraordinary statistic for the ancient world. They were renowned for their sharp wit, their fierce patriotism, and their unwavering dedication to their son's military success. A famous Spartan mother, upon handing her son his shield as he departed for war, famously said, "With it or on it," meaning he should return either victorious with his shield or dead upon it, never having surrendered. The government structure established by Lycurgus, or attributed to him, was equally unique. It was a mixed constitution, combining elements of monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy, designed to provide checks and balances and prevent any single faction from gaining absolute power. At its head were 2 kings, not one. This diarchy was a peculiar feature, with each king coming from one of 2 royal houses, the Agiads and the Eurypontids. Their power was primarily military and religious. They commanded the army in battle, served as chief priests, and presided over certain legal matters, but their political authority was limited. Real political power resided with the Gerousia, the Council of Elders. This body consisted of 28 men, all over the age of 60, elected for life, plus the 2 kings. To be elected to the Gerousia was the highest honour a Spartan could achieve, a testament to a lifetime of service and wisdom. The Gerousia prepared legislation, served as a high court, and exercised significant influence over state policy. Their wisdom and experience were considered paramount in guiding the state. The legislative process involved the appella, the assembly of all full Spartan citizens over the age of 30. The appella had the power to approve or reject laws proposed by the Gerousia and to elect officials. However, their role was largely one of ratification rather than true deliberation. Debates were rare, and voting was conducted by acclamation, with the loudest shouts determining the outcome. If the Gerousia disliked the decision of the appella, they had the power to dismiss the assembly and put the matter to a new vote. This limited democratic element ensured that the ultimate control remained with the elders. Perhaps the most powerful and distinctive institution in Spartan government was the Board of Ephors. These 5 officials were elected annually by the Apella. Their power was immense and far-reaching. They supervised the kings, ensuring they adhered to the laws, and could even bring charges against them. They oversaw the agoge, managed foreign policy, controlled the helots, and generally acted as the guardians of the Lycurgan system. Their short term in office and annual election were designed to prevent any single individual or group from accumulating too much power. The ephors could even initiate the crypteia. Their authority was so great that even the kings had to defer to them in most matters of state. The Lycurgan Reforms, whether implemented by a single visionary or through a gradual process, transformed Sparta into a unique and formidable military state. Its citizens lived a life of austerity, discipline, and unwavering dedication to the collective. Personal wealth, luxury, and individual expression were suppressed in favor of communal living and military excellence. Iron currency, bulky, and of little intrinsic value, was said to have been introduced to discourage trade and the accumulation of wealth, further isolating Sparta from the broader Greek world and reinforcing its self-sufficiency. This radical social engineering produced a society unlike any other in ancient Greece. It was a society that valued courage, obedience, and self-sacrifice above all else. Its citizens were renowned for their unparalleled military prowess, their unflinching discipline, and their laconic wit. Yet this system came at a cost. It was inherently rigid, resistant to change, and relied on the brutal subjugation of the helots. While it ensured internal stability for centuries, it also stifled innovation, artistic expression, and intellectual pursuits, areas where other Greek city-states flourished. The very strength of Sparta, its unwavering adherence to the Lycurgan ideals, would also, in time, become its weakness. As the world around it evolved and changed, but for now, Sparta stood as a beacon of military might, a testament to a vision of society where every individual existed solely for the glory and protection of the state. Perhaps these walls, built from the very stones of Mount Taygetus, truly whispered stories of iron will and unyielding dedication to the stars. A testament to a people who chose a path of hardship and discipline in pursuit of an ideal. The whispers of Lycurgus's reforms, once a gentle breeze through the olive groves, now carried the scent of iron and the distant cries of a people facing an unimaginable fate. The generations, the Dorians of Sparta, had lived alongside their neighbours, the Messenians, in the fertile plains to the west. While Sparta's lands were rugged and mountainous, Messenia boasted rich agricultural soil, a verdant abundance that beckoned with the promise of prosperity. It was this fertile allure, coupled with the burgeoning demands of Sparta's growing population and its unique social structure, that set the stage for one of the most brutal and defining conflicts in ancient Greek history, the Messenian Wars. The First Messenian War, shrouded in the mists of legend and early historical accounts, is traditionally dated to the late 8th century BCE, perhaps around 743 to 724 BCE. It was not a sudden explosion of violence, but rather a slow, grinding conquest. Spartan tradition, often embellished to glorify their ancestors, speaks of an initial provocation, a border dispute, or a transgression against their honour. Yet the underlying truth was simpler and far more ruthless. Sparta coveted Messenia's land. The war was long and arduous, a testament to the Messenians' fierce resistance. They fought for their homes, their fields, and their very way of life. The struggle reportedly lasted for nearly 2 decades, a period of immense strain on both sides. Spartan accounts, filtered through later chroniclers like Titius, a Spartan poet whose elegies were meant to inspire courage, describe desperate battles and heroic stands. Titius's verses, sung to the rhythm of the phalanx, painted a picture of Spartan determination, urging their warriors to fight to the death rather than retreat. Ultimately, Spartan military discipline and their relentless pursuit of victory prevailed. The Messenians, despite their bravery, were overwhelmed. The fall of their stronghold, Mount Ithome, marked the end of their independence. But the Spartan victory was not merely a territorial expansion. It was a profound transformation of their society. Instead of simply annexing the land and integrating the conquered people, Sparta chose a path of systematic subjugation. The Messenians were not enslaved in the traditional sense, bought and sold in markets, but rather reduced to a state of perpetual servitude known as Helotry. The Helots were a unique class in the ancient world, often described as state-owned serfs. They were tied to the land they had once owned, compelled to work it for the benefit of their Spartan masters. A significant portion of their produce, often half or more, was exacted as tribute, providing the essential agricultural surplus that freed Spartan citizens from manual labor and allowed them to dedicate their lives entirely to military training. This system, born from conquest, became the economic bedrock of the Spartan state. Without the Helots to toil in the fields, the Spartan ideal of the citizen soldier, unburdened by economic concerns, could not have existed. The imposition of Helotry was met with deep resentment and simmering rebellion. The Messenians, a proud people, did not easily forget their former freedom. This constant threat of revolt shaped Spartan society profoundly, fostering a pervasive atmosphere of fear and suspicion. It was this fear, perhaps more than any other factor, that drove Sparta's obsession with military readiness and internal cohesion. The Spartan agoge, the rigorous training system, was not just about creating formidable warriors for external wars. It was also about maintaining an iron grip on their subjugated population. The Second Messenian War, occurring roughly a generation or two after the first, around 685 to 668 BCE, was a direct consequence of this simmering resentment. The Messenians, perhaps seeing an opportunity during a period of Spartan vulnerability, or simply unable to bear their servitude any longer, rose in a massive rebellion. This war was even more desperate and brutal than the first, pushing Sparta to the brink. Accounts suggest that the Messenians found allies among other Peloponnesian states who resented Sparta's growing power. The war dragged on for years, a testament to the Messenians' enduring spirit and the sheer scale of the uprising. Titius again served as a voice of inspiration for the Spartans, his poems urging them to fight with renewed vigor, emphasizing the shame of defeat and the dire consequences of losing control over the Helots. He spoke of the need for unity and unwavering courage in the face of such a formidable internal threat. The Spartan victory in the Second Messenian War, hard-won and costly, cemented their control over Messenia for centuries to come. The Messenians were further oppressed, their lives becoming even more arduous. This repeated subjugation solidified the Helot system as an intrinsic and seemingly unchangeable part of Spartan life. It also reinforced the Spartan belief in their own military superiority and the necessity of their unique social order. The Helot system, while providing Sparta with its economic foundation, also presented a constant paradox. The very source of their wealth was also the greatest threat to their security. This inherent tension led to some of the more unsettling aspects of Spartan life. For instance, the Krypteia, or secret service, was a notorious institution. Young Spartan men, often those who had excelled in the agoge, were periodically sent out into the countryside, particularly Messenia, with orders to kill any helots they encountered who seemed too strong, too intelligent, or too independent. This was not a random act of violence, but a deliberate, state-sanctioned practice designed to instill terror and prevent organized resistance. It was a chilling manifestation of the deep-seated fear that permeated Spartan society, a fear of the silent, simmering rage of the oppressed. Historians still debate the exact nature and frequency of the Krypteia's operations, with some arguing it was a continuous institution, while others suggest it was more sporadic, reserved for times of heightened tension. Regardless of its precise application, its existence speaks volumes about the Spartan mindset and their brutal pragmatism. The Helots were not a monolithic group. They were diverse, encompassing not only the conquered Messenians, but also the Laconians, inhabitants of Sparta's own region, who had been subjugated earlier. They had no rights, no legal standing, and could not own property. They could be punished, even killed, by their Spartan masters without legal recourse. Yet, paradoxically, they were not truly chattel slaves in the Roman sense. They could not be sold outside of Laconia, and their families generally remained together. This distinction, while offering little comfort to the Helots themselves, highlights the unique nature of their servitude. They were an entire people enslaved by a state, rather than individuals owned by private citizens. The impact of the Helot system reverberated through every facet of Spartan life. It dictated their foreign policy, making them hesitant to engage in prolonged campaigns far from home, lest the Helots seize the opportunity to revolt. It shaped their alliances, as they often sought partners who could help them maintain internal order. It also fostered a siege mentality, a sense of being perpetually surrounded by potential enemies, both external and internal. This constant vigilance, this ingrained fear, contributed to Sparta's reputation as a closed and conservative society, resistant to outside influences and fiercely protective of its traditions. The Messenian Wars and the subsequent Helotry also had a profound psychological effect on the Spartans themselves. Living under the constant shadow of potential Helot uprisings instilled in them a unique blend of discipline and paranoia. It reinforced the idea that there were, yes, of life. Their very survival depended on absolute obedience, military prowess, and unwavering unity. The agoge, with its emphasis on endurance, obedience, and collective identity, was the perfect training ground for a society built on the subjugation of a vast internal population. Boys were taught from a young age to fear the Helots, to view them as a constant threat, and to be prepared to suppress any sign of defiance. The fertile plains of Messenia, once a symbol of independence and prosperity, became a symbol of Spartan power and the enduring burden of their conquest. The fields that yielded abundant harvests for Sparta also nourished the seeds of resentment and the longing for freedom among the Helots. The rhythmic clang of Spartan hammers forging weapons was matched by the silent, simmering anger of the Helots toiling in the fields, a tension that would define Sparta's existence for centuries. The echoes of the Messenian Wars, the cries of the conquered, and the grim determination of the conquerors continued to resonate through the Spartan psyche, shaping their laws, their customs, and their destiny. It was a legacy of brutal efficiency, built upon the backs of a subjugated people, a foundation of power that was simultaneously their greatest strength and their most enduring vulnerability. The sun, a fiery orb, began its slow descent over the Lycurgan plain, casting long, dancing shadows across the training grounds of Sparta. For generations, the city had honed its unique way of life, a system forged in the crucible of necessity and fear. The Messenian Wars, those brutal, protracted conflicts that had secured Sparta's fertile lands, but also enslaved a vast population, had indelibly shaped its destiny. It was the constant, simmering threat of a Helot uprising that drove the Spartans to perfect their military machine, to instill in every citizen an unwavering devotion to the state above all else. This rigid discipline, this unwavering focus on martial prowess, was not merely a choice. It was for them the very bedrock of their survival. By the early 6th century BCE, Sparta's reputation as an unyielding military power had spread far beyond the Peloponnese. Other city-states, wary of Athenian naval dominance or the shifting alliances of central Greece, began to look south, seeking the powerful ally. This growing network of states, drawn together by common interests and perhaps a shared apprehension of Sparta's formidable army, slowly coalesced into what historians would later call the Peloponnesian League. It wasn't a formal empire, nor was it a coercive dominion in the typical sense. Rather, it was a loose confederation, a military alliance bound by treaties of mutual defense, where Sparta, by virtue of its unparalleled army, naturally assumed leadership. The members, like Corinth, Megara, and Sicyon, retained their internal autonomy, but pledged military support to Sparta when called upon. This structure allowed Sparta to project its power without the logistical burden of direct rule, creating a powerful, land-based counterweight to the burgeoning naval strength of Athens. One of the earliest significant tests of this burgeoning alliance came not from within Greece, but from the east. Across the Aegean, a colossal empire was stirring, its shadow beginning to stretch westward. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, under the ambitious Darius I, had already swallowed vast swathes of territory, from the Indus Valley to Egypt, and now its gaze fell upon the wealthy Greek cities of Ionia, on the western coast of Asia Minor. These cities, ethnically Greek but under Persian suzerainty, chafed under foreign rule. In 499 BCE, Miletus, a prominent Ionian city, ignited a rebellion, seeking aid from their kinsmen across the sea. Athens, perhaps driven by democratic ideals or strategic calculation, sent ships and troops to support the revolt. Sparta, however, with its focus firmly on land power and its traditional isolationist tendencies, initially refused to become entangled. King Cleomenes I famously sent the Athenian envoys packing, warning them of the vast distance to Susa, the Persian capital. The Ionian revolt, after several years of bitter fighting, was ultimately crushed by the immense Persian war machine. Miletus was sacked, its inhabitants enslaved, and its temples burned. But the spark had been lit. Darius, enraged by the Athenian involvement, and seeing their intervention as a direct challenge to his authority, vowed vengeance. He was determined to punish Athens and by extension all of Greece for their defiance. The stage was set for the first great clash between East and West, a conflict that would forever alter the course of Western civilization. In 492 BCE, Darius launched his first expedition against Greece, primarily a naval campaign aimed at securing the Thracian coast and Macedonia. This fleet, however, was largely destroyed by a violent storm off Mount Athos. A testament to the unpredictable nature of the Aegean Sea. Undeterred, Darius prepared a second, more direct assault. In 490 BCE, a massive Persian fleet, carrying tens of thousands of infantry and cavalry, crossed the Aegean, landing on the plains of Marathon, just a short distance from Athens. The Athenians, facing overwhelming odds, desperately sent a note. Runner, Phidippides, to Sparta, pleading for immediate military assistance. Phidippides, a legendary figure whose exact historical details are somewhat debated, is said to have run the 150 miles from Athens to Sparta in just 2 days. He arrived breathless and weary to deliver his urgent plea to the Spartan ephors and kings. The Spartans listened, their faces impassive. They understood the gravity of the situation, the existential threat posed by the Persian colossus. However, their deeply ingrained religious traditions dictated that they could not march to war until the full moon, a sacred period known as the Carneia festival. Despite the urgency, they would not break with tradition. They promised to send aid, but only after the sacred days had passed. This decision, a puzzle to some modern historians, highlights the profound role of religious observance in Spartan life. While their military prowess was legendary, their piety was equally strong. Perhaps they believed that to defy the gods would be to invite disaster, a greater risk than delaying their march. Or perhaps, more pragmatically, they understood the immense logistical challenge of mobilizing their entire army and believed a few days would make little difference against such a vast foe. Whatever their precise reasoning, the Athenians were left to face the Persian might alone. At Marathon, the Athenian hoplites, bolstered by a contingent from Plataea, numbering perhaps 10,000 strong, faced a Persian force estimated to be 2 or 3 times their size. Under the brilliant leadership of Miltiades, the Athenians employed a daring tactic, weakening their centre and strengthening their flanks, allowing them to envelop the Persian lines. The battle was a resounding victory for the Greeks, a stunning upset that shattered the myth of Persian invincibility. When the Spartan army, having finally completed their religious observances, arrived at Marathon a few days later, the battlefield was silent, strewn with Persian dead. They surveyed the scene, offered congratulations to the Athenians, and then returned home. Their role in this particular drama a poignant footnote. The defeat at Marathon, though significant, was merely a temporary setback for the Persian Empire. Darius, consumed by the desire for revenge, immediately began planning an even larger invasion. However, his death in 486 BCE passed the torch to his son, Xerxes I, a man equally determined to complete his father's work. Xerxes spent years meticulously preparing, amassing an army and navy of unprecedented scale. He famously ordered the construction of a pontoon bridge across the Hellespont, allowing his vast army to march from Asia into Europe, and had a canal dug through the Athos Peninsula to avoid the fate of his father's fleet. The sheer ambition and logistical undertaking of this second invasion was staggering, a testament to the might of the Achaemenid Empire. News of this impending invasion sent shivers through the Greek city-states. This was no longer just about Athens. It was about the very survival of Greek independence. In 481 BCE, representatives from various Greek states, including Athens and Sparta, met at the Isthmus of Corinth to forge a united front. This Hellenic League, as it came to be known, was a remarkable display of interstate cooperation. a temporary setting aside of traditional rivalries in the face of a common enemy. Sparta, once again, was recognized as the undisputed leader of the land forces, while Athens, with its growing naval power, would lead the fleet. The decision to fight, rather than submit, was a momentous one, a collective gamble against an empire that seemed limitless in its resources. The first major defensive stand came in 480 BCE at the narrow mountain pass of Thermopylae. This strategic choke point, known as the Hot Gates due to its sulphurous springs, offered the Greeks a chance to negate the Persian numerical superiority. King Leonidas I of Sparta, a direct descendant of Heracles, led a small but elite force of approximately 7,000 Greeks, including his personal guard of 300 Spartiates. Their mission was to hold the pass for as long as possible, buying time for the rest of Greece to prepare. The story of Thermopylae is etched into the annals of history, a tale of extraordinary courage and sacrifice. For 2 days, the vastly outnumbered Greeks repelled wave after wave of Persian attacks. The Spartan hoplites, with their long spears and impenetrable phalanx formation, proved to be an unyielding wall of bronze and courage. Persian arrows, it was famously said, would darken the sky, to which a Spartan replied, "Good, then we will fight in the shade." However, fate, or perhaps treachery, intervened. A local Malian named Ephialtes, seeking a reward from Xerxes, revealed a hidden goat path that bypassed the main pass. Upon learning of this flanking maneuver, Leonidas, understanding that his position was now untenable, made a fateful decision. He ordered the majority of the Greek forces to retreat, saving them for future battles. He, along with his 300 Spartiates, 700 Thespians, and 400 Thebans, who were initially held as hostages but fought alongside them, remained to fight to the last man. Their sacrifice was not in vain. It bought crucial time, allowed the Athenian fleet to retreat from Artemisium, and, perhaps most importantly, ignited a fire of defiance across Greece. The image of those 300 Spartans standing firm against an empire became a powerful symbol of Greek resistance and an enduring legend. While the land forces fought at Thermopylae, the Athenian-led Greek fleet engaged the Persian navy in the Straits of Artemisium. This naval battle, fought concurrently with Thermopylae, was inconclusive, but served to further damage the Persian fleet, which had already been battered by storms. The strategic withdrawal of the Greek fleet after Thermopylae allowed them to regroup and prepare for a decisive confrontation. Following the Persian breakthrough at Thermopylae, the path to central Greece lay open. Xerxes' army swept through Boeotia, sacking and burning cities, including Athens itself. The Athenians, on the advice of their brilliant statesman Themistocles, had evacuated their city. Taking refuge on the island of Salamis and in the Peloponnese, the Acropolis, the heart of Athens, was desecrated, its temples razed. It was a dark moment for Greece, yet the spirit of resistance remained unbroken. The decisive moment came in September 480 BCE, in the narrow straits between the island of Salamis and the Attic coast. Themistocles, understanding that the larger Persian fleet would be disadvantaged in the confined waters, cleverly lured them into the strait. The ensuing Battle of Salamis was a naval masterpiece. The smaller, more agile Greek triremes, powered by skilled rowers and manned by determined hoplites, outmaneuvered and systematically destroyed the unwieldy Persian fleet. The sight of Xerxes, observing the catastrophe from his golden throne on the slopes of Mount Aigaleo, became a powerful image of Persian humiliation. This victory, largely an Athenian triumph, effectively crippled the Persian navy, severing Xerxes' supply lines and forcing him to reconsider his invasion. With his navy shattered, Xerxes, fearing being trapped in Greece, decided to retreat with a significant portion of his army, leaving behind a formidable force under his general Mardonius to complete the conquest the following spring. Mardonius wintered in Thessaly, then advanced into Attica, once again occupying Athens. The stage was set for the final, decisive land battle. In 479 BCE, the combined forces of the Hellenic League, led by the Spartan regent Pausanias, confronted Mardonius's army on the plains of Plataea in Boeotia. This was the largest hoplite battle ever fought on Greek soil, a clash of titans that would determine the fate of Greece. The Greek army, numbering perhaps 40,000 hoplites, was a diverse force. But the Spartan contingent, known for its discipline and unwavering courage, formed the backbone of the line. The battle itself was a complex affair, involving strategic maneuvers, skirmishes, and a protracted standoff. At one point, the Greek lines became somewhat disordered during a tactical retreat, leading Mardonius to believe he had an advantage. He launched a full assault, targeting the Spartan contingent. However, the Spartan phalanx, even when seemingly vulnerable, held firm. Pausanias, leading from the front, rallied his troops. The ensuing melee was brutal, a desperate struggle for survival. The Persian cavalry, a formidable force in open terrain, found themselves less effective against the disciplined Greek infantry. Mardonius himself, leading his elite Persian guard, was killed in the fighting, a critical blow to the Persian morale. With their commander fallen and their lines breaking, the Persian army disintegrated. What followed was a rout as the Greeks pursued and cut down the fleeing Persians. The victory at Plataea was total and decisive. It marked the end of the Persian wars on mainland Greece, a testament to the unity and resilience of the Greek city-states. On the very same day, according to tradition, the Greek fleet achieved another victory at the Battle of Mycale, off the coast of Ionia, further crippling the Persian navy and sparking renewed rebellions among the Ionian Greeks. The Persian Wars had a profound and lasting impact on Greece. They fostered a sense of shared Greek identity, a collective awareness of being Hellenes, distinct from the barbarians of the East. For Sparta, the wars reaffirmed its position as the preeminent military power on land. Its leadership at Thermopylae and Plataea cemented its reputation for unparalleled bravery and discipline. Pausanias, the victor of Plataea, was hailed as a national hero, though his later ambitions and alleged pro-Persian leanings would lead to his downfall. Yet, even in victory, the seeds of future conflict were sown. Athens, having borne the brunt of the Persian invasion and having built a formidable navy, emerged from the wars with greatly enhanced prestige and power. Its democratic ideals, tested and proven in the crucible of war, seemed to flourish. This rise of Athenian power, particularly its dominance of the sea and its formation of the Delian League, an alliance ostensibly for mutual defense against Persia, but which quickly became an Athenian empire, inevitably led to friction with the land-based Peloponnesian League led by Sparta. The two great powers, once united against a common foe, now found themselves on a collision course. Their differing ideologies and ambitions destined to clash in the devastating Peloponnesian War. Historians still debate the precise motivations behind Sparta's actions during the Persian Wars? Was their delay at Marathon truly due to religious piety, or was it a calculated risk, a desire to conserve their forces, or even a subtle reluctance to aid Athens, their emerging rival? Similarly, the exact size of the Persian army at Thermopylae and Plataea remains a subject of scholarly dispute, with ancient sources often exaggerating numbers for dramatic effect. The enduring image of the 300 Spartans, however, transcends mere statistics, embodying a spirit of defiant courage that resonated through the ages. The Peloponnesian League, solidified by the shared experience of the Persian Wars, remained the cornerstone of Spartan foreign policy for decades to come. It provided Sparta with a network of allies and a buffer against external threats, allowing it to maintain its unique social and military system. The war had shown that even the mightiest empire could be defeated by a united, determined defense. Perhaps the winds that swept across the plains of Plataea carried not just the dust of battle, but also the whisper of a new era. An era where the fate of Greece would be decided not by foreign invaders, but by the Greeks themselves in the bitter struggles that lay ahead. The air, once thick with the scent of olive groves and the murmur of philosophers, began to hum with a different kind of tension. The fragile peace that had settled over the Hellenic world, a peace often punctuated by skirmishes and shifting alliances, was now stretched taut, threatening to snap. For decades, the two great powers, Athens and Sparta, had coexisted in an uneasy truce, their distinct ideologies and ambitions simmering beneath the surface. Athens, a vibrant democracy, the heart of an expansive maritime empire, its coffers overflowing with tribute, its citizens engaged in a flourishing intellectual and artistic life. Sparta, a stern oligarchy, its society rigidly structured around military discipline, its strength rooted in its formidable hoplite army and its control over the Peloponnese. The seeds of conflict had been sown long before the first arrow flew. The Delian League, forged in the aftermath of the Persian Wars as a defensive alliance against future incursions, had gradually transformed under Athenian leadership into an instrument of imperial power. Cities that had once contributed ships and men now paid tribute in silver, their autonomy slowly eroded. This Athenian dominance, both economic and political, was viewed with growing alarm by Sparta and its allies, particularly Corinth, a powerful naval and commercial rival of Athens. The Corinthians, feeling increasingly squeezed by Athenian expansion into their trade routes, became vocal proponents for war within the Peloponnesian League, Sparta's own alliance system. The immediate spark, however, came from a series of entangled disputes. First, the conflict between Corinth and its colony, Corcyra, a significant naval power in its own right. Corcyra, seeking to maintain its independence from its mother city, appealed to Athens for assistance. Athens, seeing an opportunity to gain an ally with a substantial fleet, offered support, leading to a naval engagement at Sparta in 433 BCE, where Athenian ships fought alongside Corcyrian vessels against Corinthian forces. Though not a full-scale declaration of war, it was a clear sign of Athenian willingness to intervene in disputes involving Peloponnesian League members. Next came the siege of Potidaea. Potidaea, a Corinthian colony, but also a tributary ally of Athens, found itself caught between two masters. When Athens demanded that Potidaea dismantle its walls and dismiss Corinthian magistrates, the city revolted, appealing to Corinth and Sparta for aid. Sparta, under pressure from its allies, promised support, though it was slow to materialize. The Athenian siege of Potidaea, a long and costly affair, further inflamed tensions, demonstrating Athens' resolve to enforce its imperial will. Finally, the Megarian decree. Megara, a city-state allied with Sparta, was accused by Athens of harboring runaway slaves and cultivating sacred land. In response, Athens passed a decree that effectively banned Megarian merchants from all markets within the Athenian Empire, a devastating blow to Megara's economy. This act, seen by many as a deliberate provocation, was the final straw. Historians still debate the true intent behind the Megarian decree. Was it a genuine grievance, a strategic move to weaken a Spartan ally, or merely a reflection of Pericles' uncompromising stance? Regardless, it served as a powerful rallying cry for the Peloponnesian League, who saw it as undeniable proof of Athenian aggression. In 432 BCE, a Congress of the Peloponnesian League was convened at Sparta. Representatives from the allied states voiced their grievances, painting a vivid picture of Athenian arrogance and expansionism. The Corinthians, in particular, delivered a scathing indictment, contrasting Athenian dynamism and audacity with Spartan slowness and inaction. They urged Sparta to abandon its cautious policy and embrace war. After much deliberation, the Spartan assembly, swayed by the arguments of its allies and its own growing apprehension about Athenian power, voted for war. Thucydides, the great historian of the conflict, noted that the Spartans were compelled to fight, not because they were persuaded by the speeches, but because they feared the further growth of Athenian power. The war that ensued, known as the Peloponnesian War, would last for nearly 3 decades, reshaping the political landscape of ancient Greece and leaving an indelible mark on its history. It was a conflict of 2 titans, each possessing distinct strengths and weaknesses. Athens, with its formidable navy, its vast financial resources, and its ability to import supplies by sea, was virtually impregnable behind its long walls, which connected the city to its port of Piraeus. Sparta, with its invincible hoplite army, its mastery of land warfare, and its network of loyal allies, was a force to be reckoned with on the ground. The initial phase of the war, often called the Archidamian War, after the Spartan king Archidamus II, saw Sparta adopt a strategy of annual invasions of Attica, the Athenian countryside. Each spring, the Peloponnesian army would march into Attica, devastating the land, burning crops, and destroying homes. Their aim was to draw the Athenians out from behind their walls and force them into a decisive land battle where Spartan hoplite superiority would undoubtedly prevail. Pericles, the brilliant Athenian statesman, understood this strategy perfectly. He implemented a counter-strategy that was both audacious and deeply unpopular. He ordered the entire population of Attica to abandon their farms and homes and seek refuge within the fortified walls of Athens and Piraeus. This meant leaving their ancestral lands, their livelihoods, and their possessions to be ravaged by the enemy. It was a painful sacrifice. But Pericles knew that Athens could not win a land battle against Sparta. Instead, he planned to rely on Athens's naval supremacy. The city, supplied by sea, could endure the Spartan invasions indefinitely. Meanwhile, the Athenian fleet would launch raids along the Peloponnesian coast, disrupting trade, seizing supplies, and inflicting damage on Spartan allies. The first Spartan invasion of Attica in 431 BCE was a harrowing experience for the Athenians. As the Peloponnesian army swept through the countryside, plumes of smoke rose from burning farms, signaling the destruction. The sight of their lands being laid waste, their temples desecrated, and their homes plundered was agonizing for the Athenian citizens huddled within the city walls. The tension inside Athens was palpable. The confined space, the sheer number of people, and the forced idleness created a breeding ground for discontent. Yet, Pericles remained steadfast, urging his people to endure, reminding them of their strength at sea and their ability to outlast the enemy. One lesser-known detail from this period is the unusual truce that occurred during the invasion of 431 BCE. While the Peloponnesian army was devastating Attica, a total solar eclipse occurred. This celestial event, viewed with awe and trepidation by both sides, was interpreted by some as an omen. While it didn't halt the war, it certainly gave pause to the soldiers and leaders, a brief moment of shared wonder and fear amidst the brutality. Perhaps these walls whispered stories to the stars of the anxieties of the people within. The Athenian naval strategy proved effective in frustrating the Spartans. In the summer of 431 BCE, the Athenian fleet launched its first major expedition, sailing around the Peloponnese and raiding the coasts of Laconia, Messenia, and Elis. They captured a town of Methone, though it was later retaken, and inflicted damage on the coastal regions, demonstrating Athens' ability to strike at the heart of Spartan territory. These raids were not designed to achieve decisive victories, but rather to harass the enemy, disrupt their economy, and prevent them from concentrating all their forces on Attica. The second Spartan invasion of Attica in 430 BCE brought with it an unforeseen and devastating calamity, the plague. The overcrowded conditions within Athens, coupled with poor sanitation, created an ideal environment for the rapid spread of disease. The plague, thought to be a form of typhus or typhoid fever, ravaged the city, claiming countless lives, including that of Pericles himself in 429 BCE. Thucydides, who himself contracted and survived the plague, provided a chillingly detailed account of its symptoms and its profound impact on Athenian society. The plague not only decimated the population, but also eroded morale, leading to a breakdown of law and order and a questioning of Pericles' leadership. The loss of Pericles, a visionary leader who had guided Athens through its golden age and formulated its war strategy, was a catastrophic blow. His successors, often more opportunistic and less strategic, struggled to maintain his cohesive vision. Despite the plague and the annual invasions, Athens continued to hold its own. The Spartan strategy of attrition on land was proving insufficient to break Athenian resolve. The war settled into a grim stalemate, a war of exhaustion. The Athenians, though suffering greatly, maintained their naval dominance. In 428 BCE, the city of Mytilene on the island of Lesbos, a significant Athenian ally, revolted. This was a serious challenge to Athenian imperial control. The Athenian response was swift and brutal. After a long siege, Mytilene surrendered. The initial Athenian decision, influenced by the demagogue Cleon, was to execute all the men and enslave all the women and children. However, a fierce debate in the Athenian assembly, famously recounted by Thucydides, led to a reversal of this harsh decree. A second ship was dispatched, arriving just in time to prevent the massacre, though the leaders of the revolt were executed and Mytilene's fleet was confiscated. This incident highlighted the often ruthless nature of Athenian imperial power and the internal struggles within its democracy. The war also saw the emergence of new tactics and strategies. In 425 BCE, The Athenians achieved a significant victory at Pylos and Sphacteria. Demosthenes, an Athenian general, established a fortified outpost at Pylos on the coast of Messenia, deep within Spartan territory. A Spartan force attempting to dislodge the Athenians became trapped on the island of Sphacteria. The Athenians, under the leadership of Cleon, launched a daring assault and captured 292 Spartan hoplites, including 120 Spartiates, full Spartan citizens. This was an unprecedented humiliation for Sparta, as Spartiates were considered invincible in battle. The captured Spartiates became valuable hostages, giving Athens a powerful bargaining chip. This victory at Pylos and Sphacteria significantly shifted the momentum of the war. Sparta, eager to recover its captured citizens, repeatedly sought peace. However, Athens, emboldened by its success and influenced by the hawkish Cleon, rejected these overtures, believing it could achieve an even more favorable outcome. This decision, in hindsight, proved to be a critical miscalculation, prolonging the war and leading to further suffering. Meanwhile, the war expanded to new fronts. In 424 BCE, the brilliant Spartan general Brasidas launched a daring campaign in Thrace, far to the north. Brasidas, known for his charismatic leadership and diplomatic skill, managed to dissuade several Athenian allies in the region to revolt, notably the important city of Amphipolis, a major source of timber and silver for Athens. The loss of Amphipolis was a severe blow to Athens, leading to the exile of Thucydides, who was blamed for its fall. The campaign in Thrace highlighted Sparta's ability to innovate and challenge Athenian power, even in areas where Athens was traditionally strong. In 422 BCE, a decisive battle took place at Amphipolis. Cleon, leading an Athenian force, marched to retake the city. He was met by Brasidas and his Peloponnesian army. In the ensuing battle, both Cleon and Brasidas were killed. The death of these two influential figures, one a leading Athenian hawk and the other Sparta's most daring general, created an opportunity for peace. The war had become a costly and exhausting endeavor for both sides, and the desire for an end to the fighting was growing. The stage was set for a temporary cessation of hostilities, the Archidamian War. The first phase of the Peloponnesian War had ended in a stalemate, with neither side achieving a decisive victory. The initial Spartan strategy of land invasions had failed to break Athens, and Athens' naval dominance, while effective, had not been enough to force Sparta to its knees. The human cost had been immense, and the plague had added a layer of unforeseen horror. The capture of the Spartiate prisoners at Sphacteria and the deaths of Cleon and Brasidas at Amphipolis had created a unique window for diplomacy. The peace that would follow, however, would prove to be a fragile one, a mere interlude before the conflict would erupt once more, even more fiercely than before. The echoes of the plague, the memories of burning farms, and the lingering bitterness of loss would continue to shape the decisions of the warring city-states, propelling them towards the next, even more destructive, chapter of their epic struggle. The war, a monstrous beast of attrition, continued its slow, grinding work. Though Athens had suffered a devastating blow with the plague and Pericles' death, their naval supremacy remained formidable, a lifeline stretching across the Aegean. The Spartans, for their part, were masters of the land, their hoplite phalanx an almost unstoppable force in open battle. Yet the sea was a realm they struggled to conquer, and without command of the waves, they could not truly starve Athens into submission. This created a peculiar stalemate a dance of thrust and parry across land and sea, each side seeking the decisive advantage that always seemed to elude them. The year 425 BCE brought a surprising turn of events that deeply shook Spartan confidence. A small Athenian force, led by the general Demosthenes, landed on the island of Sphacteria, off the coast of Pylos in Messenia. Their objective was to establish a fortified outpost, a thorn in the side of Spartan territory. What followed was a disaster for Sparta. A contingent of 420 Spartan hoplites, including a significant number of Spartiates, the elite full citizens, became trapped on the island. The Athenians, with their naval superiority, blockaded the channel, preventing any escape or reinforcement. The Spartans, renowned for their unyielding spirit, were in an unprecedented predicament. Never before had so many of their elite warriors been captured alive. After a desperate struggle and facing starvation, 120 Spartiates, along with their Helot attendants, surrendered. This event sent shockwaves through the Hellenic world. The very idea of Spartan surrender was almost unthinkable, a stain on their reputation for unwavering courage. For Athens, it was a much-needed morale boost, and the captured Spartans became valuable bargaining chips. The capture of these elite warriors led to a temporary truce and negotiations, but ultimately no lasting peace could be forged. The underlying tensions and ambitions were too deeply entrenched. The war resumed, marked by a series of smaller engagements and raids. One such conflict was the Battle of Amphipolis in 422 BCE. This Thracian city, rich in timber and silver mines, was strategically vital for Athens. It had been captured by the brilliant Spartan general Brasidas a few years prior, a man known for his diplomatic skill as much as his military prowess. In an attempt to retake it, the Athenian general Cleon, a prominent demagogue and political rival of Nicias, led a force to Amphipolis. The ensuing battle was a sharp, decisive Spartan victory, but it came at a high cost for both sides. Brasidas, the audacious Spartan, was mortally wounded, as was Cleon, the fiery Athenian. The loss of these two influential figures, one a skilled military leader and the other a powerful voice in Athenian politics, paved the way for a renewed push for peace. With Brasidas and Cleon gone, the more moderate voices in both Athens and Sparta gained prominence. Nicias, a respected Athenian general and statesman who had long advocated for peace, played a crucial role. In 421 BCE, the Peace of Nicias was signed. Intended to bring an end to the decade-long conflict, the terms stipulated a 50-year truce and a return to the pre-war status quo, with each side returning captured territories and prisoners. The captured Spartiates from Sphacteria were finally returned home, a great relief to Sparta. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the weary world of Greece might finally breathe freely. However, the Peace of Nicias proved to be a fragile and ultimately illusory calm. Many allies on both sides felt betrayed or unsatisfied with the terms. Corinth, a key Spartan ally, refused to ratify the treaty, feeling their interests had been overlooked. Argos, a traditional rival of Sparta, saw an opportunity to rise in power, forming alliances with disgruntled Peloponnesian states. The spirit of conflict, it seemed, was too deeply ingrained to be easily extinguished. Historians still debate the true intentions behind the signing of the Peace of Nicias. Was it a genuine attempt at lasting peace, or merely a strategic pause for both sides to regroup and rearm, knowing that the fundamental issues remained unresolved? The subsequent events suggest the latter, as the peace quickly unraveled into a Cold War, punctuated by proxy conflicts and shifting alliances. Alcibiades, a charismatic and controversial Athenian aristocrat, emerged as a dominant figure during this period of uneasy peace. A protégé of Pericles and a dazzling orator, he was also ambitious, extravagant, and notoriously unpredictable. He actively worked to undermine the Peace of Nicias, advocating for a more aggressive foreign policy. His influence led Athens into one of its most audacious and ultimately disastrous ventures, the Sicilian expedition. In 415 BCE, Athens launched a massive naval and military expedition to Sicily, ostensibly to aid their ally Segesta against Syracuse, a powerful Dorian city-state. But the true aim, driven by Alcibiades' grand vision, was to conquer Sicily, gain control of its vast resources, and use it as a springboard for further expansion, perhaps even to challenge Sparta on land. The expedition was an undertaking of immense scale, involving hundreds of ships and thousands of hoplites, archers, soldiers, and cavalry. It was an unprecedented display of Athenian power and ambition. Yet from the very beginning, it was plagued by ill omens and internal strife. Just before the fleet sailed, the Hermes, sacred stone pillars with the head of Hermes, across Athens were mysteriously mutilated, an act of sacrilege that sent shivers of fear and suspicion through the city. Alcibiades himself was implicated in this scandal, as well as in a charge of profaning the Eleusinian mysteries, a deeply revered religious rite. Though he initially sailed with the fleet, he was recalled to Athens to face trial. Fearing conviction, he famously defected to Sparta, offering his counsel and knowledge of Athenian strategy to their bitter enemy. This defection was a monumental blow to Athens, as Alcibiades possessed intimate knowledge of their military plans and weaknesses. The Sicilian expedition itself devolved into a protracted, brutal siege of Syracuse. The Syracusans, aided by Spartan advisors, most notably the astute general Gylippus, put up a fierce resistance. The Athenians, despite their initial numerical superiority, found themselves bogged down in a difficult land campaign, far from home. Their supply lines were stretched, and their morale began to wane. The Spartans, guided by Alcibiades' advice, sent reinforcements to Syracuse, further strengthening the city's defences. Under the command of Nicias and Demosthenes, who had been sent as a reinforcement, suffered repeated setbacks. The siege works they constructed were countered, their assaults repelled, and their ships, once the pride of Greece, became trapped in the great harbour of Syracuse. The final act of the Sicilian tragedy unfolded in 413 BCE. After a desperate attempt to break out of the harbour failed, the Athenian fleet was utterly annihilated in a series of naval battles. Thousands of Athenian soldiers and sailors were captured or killed. Those who survived the naval disaster attempted a desperate overland retreat, but they were relentlessly pursued by the Syracusan and Spartan forces. Exhausted, starving, and demoralized, the remnants of the Athenian army were eventually surrounded and forced to surrender. The captured Athenians were then subjected to a horrific fate, imprisoned in the stone quarries of Syracuse, where many perished from exposure, disease, and starvation. It was an unmitigated catastrophe for Athens, a loss of manpower, ships, and prestige from which they would never fully recover. The expedition, which had begun with such grand hopes, had ended in total ruin, leaving Athens severely weakened and vulnerable. With Athens reeling from the Sicilian disaster, Sparta and its allies intensified their efforts. The war entered its final, most destructive phase, often referred to as the Decelean War, named after the Spartan fortification of Decelia in Attica. Following Alcibiades' advice, the Spartans established a permanent garrison at Decelia in 413 BCE. This strategic move was devastating for Athens. Decelia overlooked the Attic plain, allowing the Spartans to raid Athenian territory year-round. This cut off Athens' supply lines, land-based food supply, forcing them to rely entirely on seaborne imports. It also liberated over 20,000 Athenian slaves, many of whom were skilled laborers, further crippling Athens' economy and manpower. The Athenians were now effectively besieged in their own city, their countryside ravaged and their resources dwindling. The war at sea, however, was far from over. Despite the losses in Sicily, Athens still possessed a formidable navy, though its quality and numbers were declining. The Spartans, recognizing that naval power was now the key to victory, began to build their own fleet, often with financial support from the Persian Empire. This unlikely alliance between the Hellenic states and the ancient Persian foe was a testament to the desperate nature of the conflict. Persia, eager to see the Greek city-states weaken each other, provided gold to Sparta, which was used to pay for ships and rowers. This influx of Persian wealth allowed Sparta to challenge Athens' naval supremacy directly. The final years of the war saw a series of naval engagements in the Aegean. Alcibiades, having fallen out of favor with Sparta, eventually returned to the Athenian side in 411 BCE, demonstrating his remarkable ability to adapt and survive political shifts. He achieved some notable naval victories for Athens, showcasing his strategic genius. However, his mercurial nature and political enemies ultimately led to his final exile. The Athenians, in a desperate attempt to fund their war effort, even resorted to melting down the golden statues from the Acropolis, a poignant symbol of their dwindling resources and the immense cost of the conflict. The decisive blow came in 405 BCE at the Battle of Aegospotami. The Athenian fleet, under the command of Conon and others, was anchored on the beach at Aegospotami. On the Hellespont, a vital choke point for grain shipments from the Black Sea to Athens, the Spartan fleet, commanded by Lysander, a brilliant and ruthless admiral, caught the Athenians by surprise. Lysander, having observed the Athenian habit of dispersing their crews ashore to forage, launched a sudden attack. The result was a catastrophic defeat for Athens. Almost the entire Athenian fleet, numbering around 180 ships, was captured or destroyed. Thousands of Athenian sailors and generals were captured, and many were executed by Lysander, a brutal act that foreshadowed the harshness of the coming peace. With their navy annihilated, Athens was completely cut off from its grain supply. The city, already weakened by years of war and siege, began to starve. Lysander then sailed his victorious fleet to the Piraeus, the port of Athens, and blockaded it. Inside the city walls, the situation became desperate. The long walls, which had once been Athens' impregnable shield, now became a prison. Famine set in, and the proud city, once the beacon of democracy and culture, faced utter annihilation. In 404 BCE, after a siege of several months, Athens was forced to surrender unconditionally. The terms of surrender were harsh. The long walls, the very symbol of Athenian power and independence, were to be torn down to the music of flutes, a deliberate act of humiliation. The Athenian fleet was reduced to a mere 12 ships. Athens was forced to dismantle its democratic government and accept an oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants, imposed by Sparta. This regime, led by Critias, a former student of Socrates, was notoriously brutal, executing many Athenian citizens and seizing their property. Though the 30 tyrants were overthrown after a short, bloody period, and democracy was restored, Athens' power was irrevocably broken. The Peloponnesian War, lasting for 27 years, had finally ended. Sparta, the landlocked military powerhouse, had emerged victorious, but at a tremendous cost to the entire Greek world. The war had been a brutal, destructive conflict that had ravaged Greece, exhausted its resources, and decimated its population. It had ended the golden age of Athens and ushered in a period of Spartan hegemony. Yet even in victory, Sparta faced new challenges. Its rigid social and political system, so effective in war, was ill-suited to govern a vast empire. The influx of wealth and the temptations of power began to corrode the traditional Spartan virtues of austerity and discipline. The very nature of Spartan society, designed for constant military readiness, struggled to adapt to the responsibilities of empire. The war had not brought lasting peace or stability to Greece, but rather a new set of power dynamics and simmering resentments that would continue to shape the Hellenic world for decades to come. The echoes of the flutes that accompanied the destruction of the Long Walls would reverberate across the landscape, a haunting melody marking the end of one era and the uncertain dawn of another. The dust of the Peloponnesian War, though settling, still carried the echoes of conflict across the Greek world. Athens, once the shining beacon of democracy and naval might, lay humbled, its walls partially dismantled, its spirit bruised. Sparta, the victor, now stood at the pinnacle of its power, a formidable military machine that had finally brought its long-standing rival to its knees. This was the dawn of the Spartan hegemony, a period when the austere city-state, for a brief flicker of history, became the undisputed master of Greece. Yet even in this moment of triumph, the very nature of Sparta, its rigid social structure, and its deep-seated isolationism would sow the seeds of its own eventual decline. The year 404 BCE marked the end of the war, and with it, the beginning of Sparta's ascendancy. Lysander, the brilliant Spartan admiral who had orchestrated the decisive victory at Aegospotami, became the architect of this new order. He established oligarchic governments, known as decarchies, rule of 10, in many of the former Athenian allied states, each supported by a Spartan garrison and overseen by a Spartan harmost, or governor. This was a stark departure from the traditional Spartan policy of non-interference in the internal affairs of other polis. The intent was clear: to ensure Spartan control and prevent any resurgence of Athenian power or democratic ideals. In Athens itself, Lysander installed the notorious 30 tyrants, an oligarchic regime that quickly devolved into a reign of terror, executing political opponents and confiscating property. This brutal suppression, however, proved short-lived. Within a year, democratic exiles, led by Thrasybulus, successfully overthrew the 30, demonstrating the deep-seated resistance to Spartan-imposed rule and the enduring appeal of democratic principles, even in defeat. The Spartan ideal, forged in the fires of the Lycurgan Reforms, was one of austerity, discipline, and military prowess. Their citizens, the homoioi, or equals, lived a communal life, their days dedicated to military training and civic duty. Wealth was discouraged, luxury shunned, and personal ambition subsumed by the needs of the state. This system had produced an unbeatable army, but it was ill-suited to governing a vast and diverse empire. The Spartan harmosts, often unaccustomed to the temptations of power and wealth, frequently succumbed to corruption, enriching themselves at the expense of the very cities they were meant to govern. This behavior, so antithetical to the Spartan ideal, bred resentment and alienation among their newly acquired subjects. The rigid agagae, the Spartan system of education and training, prepared men for the battlefield, not for diplomacy or administration. They were masters of war, but novices in the delicate art of empire. Moreover, the very success of Sparta created internal pressures. The influx of wealth, particularly the gold and silver acquired from Persia and the spoils of war, began to erode the traditional Spartan values, while the homoioi were forbidden from possessing precious metals. The state itself accumulated vast sums. This wealth, however, did not trickle down to all citizens equally. The kleros, the land allotments that formed the economic basis of Spartan citizenship, were increasingly concentrated in fewer hands due to inheritance patterns and the inability of some citizens to maintain their plots. This led to a growing disparity between the rich and the poor within Sparta itself, threatening the very notion of the homoioi as equals. The number of full citizens, the backbone of the Spartan army, began to dwindle, a demographic crisis that would plague Sparta for the remainder of its existence. Historians still debate the exact causes and extent of this decline in citizen numbers, with some pointing to battlefield losses, others to the accumulation of land by a few wealthy families, and still others to a combination of factors. Sparta's foreign policy during its hegemony was also fraught with difficulties. Their victory over Athens had been significantly aided by Persian gold, and the Spartans had promised to cede the Greek cities of Ionia back to the Persian Empire in exchange for this financial support. However, after the war, Sparta found itself embroiled in conflicts with Persia over these very cities. The Spartans, under King Agesilaus II, launched campaigns into Asia Minor in the late 390s BCE, aiming to liberate the Ionian Greeks. While Agesilaus achieved some military successes, these campaigns were costly and ultimately futile, diverting Spartan resources and attention away from maintaining order in Greece. The Persians, ever adept at playing one Greek state against another, began to funnel money to Sparta's former allies, Thebes, Corinth, and Argos, encouraging them to form an anti-Spartan coalition. This coalition ignited the Corinthian War, 395 to 387 BCE, a conflict that pitted Sparta against a formidable alliance backed by Persian gold. The war was a brutal and costly affair for Sparta, forcing them to fight on multiple fronts. Their once unbeatable hoplite army suffered significant defeats, most notably at Haliartus, where Lysander himself was killed, and at Lycaeum, where an entire Spartan mora, a military unit, was annihilated by the Athenian light-armed troops of Iphicrates. These defeats shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility. To end the war, Sparta was forced to negotiate the King's Peace, also known as the Peace of Antalcidas, in 387 BCE, brokered by Persia. This humiliating treaty recognized Persian control over the Greek cities of Ionia and declared the autonomy of all other Greek city-states, effectively undermining Sparta's imperial ambitions. The King's Peace was a stark reminder that even the most powerful states could be dictated to by a greater power, and it highlighted Sparta's inability to project its power effectively beyond the Peloponnese without external support. Despite the setbacks of the Corinthian War, Sparta still held significant sway. they continued to intervene in the affairs of other polis, often with heavy-handed tactics. One particularly egregious act was the seizure of the Cadmea, the citadel of Thebes, in 382 BCE, by a Spartan general named Phoebus without official orders. This act, though initially condemned by the Spartan ephors, was ultimately sanctioned when they saw the strategic advantage it offered. The Thebans, however, resented this blatant violation of their sovereignty. 3 years later, in 379 BCE, a group of Theban exiles, led by Pelopidas and Epaminondas, launched a daring coup, liberating Thebes from Spartan control and executing the Spartan-backed oligarchs. This act of defiance marked a turning point, signaling the beginning of Thebes' rise as a major power and the accelerating decline of Spartan dominance. The stage was set for a final, decisive confrontation. Thebes, under the brilliant leadership of Epaminondas, developed innovative military tactics that challenged the traditional Spartan phalanx. At the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, Epaminondas employed an oblique formation, concentrating his forces on the left flank and creating a deep column that smashed through the elite Spartan right wing. This battle was a cataclysm for Sparta. Not only did they suffer heavy casualties, but their king, Cleombrotus I, was killed. More significantly, the myth of Spartan invincibility was irrevocably broken. The victory at Leuctra sent shockwaves across Greece, demonstrating that the seemingly unbreakable Spartan military machine could be defeated. It was a moment that redefined the balance of power in the Greek world, ushering in the brief period of Theban hegemony. Following Leuctra, Epaminondas led Theban invasions into Laconia, the Spartan homeland, in 370 BCE. This was an unprecedented event. For centuries, Sparta had remained untouched by foreign invasion. The Thebans ravaged the sea. Countryside, liberated the Helots, the enslaved population who formed the backbone of the Spartan economy, and established the independent city of Messene, providing a home for the formerly enslaved Messenians. The liberation of Messenia was a devastating blow to Sparta, as it deprived them of the vast agricultural labour force that supported their citizen army. This act alone crippled Sparta's economic and military capacity, from which it would never fully recover. The Spartan population, already dwindling, found itself unable to sustain its traditional way of life without the Helot labour. The decline was swift and irreversible. Sparta, once the arbiter of Greece, became a shadow of its former self. Its military power waned, its political influence diminished, and its unique social system, once its greatest strength, became anachronistic in a changing world. The very isolation that had preserved its distinct culture also prevented it from adapting to new realities. While Sparta would continue to exist as a city-state for centuries, even playing a minor role in later Hellenistic and Roman periods, its era of true power had ended. The fall of Sparta was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual erosion, hastened by its inability to transition from a purely military state to an effective imperial power. Its internal demographic and economic struggles, and the emergence of new, innovative military strategies from rivals like Thebes. The whispers of its former glory would linger, a testament to a unique society that for a time had dominated the ancient world, but ultimately proved unable to sustain the very empire it had fought so hard to win. The dust of Leuctra settled. not in the familiar red haze of Spartan victory, but in a strange, unsettling quiet. For centuries, the very mention of the Spartan phalanx had instilled fear, a deep, primal respect for its unyielding discipline. Yet, on that fateful day in 371 BC, the impossible had occurred. Epaminondas, the brilliant Theban general, had shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility. His innovative oblique formation, a daring concentration of force on one wing, had punched through the Spartan lines, a strategy utterly alien to the rigid, frontal assaults Sparta had perfected. The shockwaves reverberated across the Hellenic world, a tremor that shook the very foundations of power. Thebes, long overshadowed by Athens and Sparta, had risen, not merely to challenge, but to decisively defeat the Peloponnesian League's undisputed leader. The loss at Leuctra was not just a military defeat, it was a profound psychological blow. For generations, Spartan mothers had sent their sons to war with the chilling exhortation, "Come back with your shield or on it." Now, many had come back on them, or not at all, and the shield itself seemed to bear the mark of a new, unfamiliar shame. The Spartan population, already dwindling due to their rigid social structure and the constant demands of military service, suffered irreplaceable losses. The traditional Spartan way of life, built upon the absolute supremacy of its citizen soldiers, began to fray at the edges. The true genius of Epaminondas, however, lay not just in his battlefield tactics, but in his strategic vision. He understood that to truly dismantle Spartan power, he had to strike at its heart, the Helot system. The Helots, the subjugated population of Messenia and Laconia, were the silent, unseen foundation upon which Spartan society rested. They tilled the land, produced the food, and allowed the Spartan citizens to dedicate themselves entirely to military training. Without the Helots, the Spartan system would crumble. So in the winter of 370 BC, less than a year after Leuctra, Epaminondas led a massive Theban-led coalition into the Peloponnese. Their target was Messenia, the fertile land that had been under Spartan control for centuries, its people enslaved and forced to serve their Lacedaemonian masters. It was a bold, unprecedented move. For the first time in centuries, a foreign army marched deep into Spartan territory unhindered. The Spartans, weakened and demoralized, could do little to stop them. The liberation of Messenia was a moment of profound historical significance. Epaminondas oversaw the founding of a new city, Messene, on the slopes of Mount Ithome, a symbolic act of defiance and a practical measure to secure the newly independent Messenians. Walls, strong and imposing, rose around the city, a tangible barrier against any future Spartan attempts at reconquest. The Helots of Messenia, who had endured generations of brutal servitude, were now free. They were granted their own land, their own government, and the right to defend themselves. This act alone crippled Sparta's economic base and manpower reserves. The fertile plains of Messenia, which had fed Sparta for so long, now fed its former slaves. The loss of Messenia was in many ways an even greater blow than the defeat at Leuctra. It was the severing of the very lifeline that sustained the Spartan way of life. The years that followed were marked by a period known as the Theban Hegemony. For a brief but intense decade, Thebes dominated Greece, a testament to the military and political brilliance of Epaminondas and his general Pelopidas. They led further campaigns into the Peloponnese, continuing to chip away at Spartan influence and solidify the independence of former Spartan allies. The Arcadian League, a a confederation of Peloponnesian cities, was strengthened, providing a buffer against any resurgent Spartan power. Yet the Theban hegemony, like all hegemonies before it, carried the seeds of its own decline. The very act of liberating Messenia, while strategically brilliant, also created new tensions. Other Greek city-states, accustomed to the familiar rivalry between Athens and Sparta, found the rise of Thebes unsettling. Thebes, though powerful, lacked the long-standing diplomatic networks and the naval power of Athens, or the deep-rooted military tradition and extensive Peloponnesian alliances of Sparta. Its power was, in many ways, tied to the genius of its two great leaders. The end of the Theban dominance came, tragically, at the Battle of Mantinea in 362 BC. Epaminondas, once again leading his forces against a coalition that included Sparta, Athens, and other Peloponnesian states, secured another victory. But this victory came at an unbearable cost. Epaminondas himself was mortally wounded. As he lay dying, he reportedly asked if his shield was safe, and upon being told it was, he smiled. He then asked about the battle's outcome. Satisfied with the victory, he then advised the Thebans to make peace, knowing that without him, their power would wane. His death marked the effective end of Theban supremacy. The Greek world, exhausted by decades of constant warfare, found itself in a power vacuum, a state of disunity that would prove tragically vulnerable. For Sparta, the post-Leuctra era was one of slow, painful decline. Stripped of Messenia, their Helot workforce, and their aura of invincibility, they struggled to adapt. Their population continued to shrink, exacerbated by their rigid social rules that limited citizenship and discouraged foreign interaction. The famed Lycurgan system, designed for a small, self-sufficient warrior state, proved inflexible in the face of changing geopolitical realities. They could no longer field the formidable armies of old. Their once feared phalanx was now just one among many, and often not even the best. Historians still debate the precise reasons for Sparta's inability to recover from these blows. Was it the inherent inflexibility of their system, so resistant to change? Or was it the demographic crisis, a slow bleed of manpower that no amount of training could replenish? Perhaps it was a combination of both. A proud, insular society, unable to adapt to a world that was rapidly evolving beyond its traditional parameters. The very qualities that had made them strong, their unwavering adherence to tradition, their suspicion of foreign ideas, their focus on military excellence above all else, now became their undoing. While the city-states of Greece continued their internecine squabbles, a new power was quietly, yet steadily, rising in the north. Macedon, a kingdom long dismissed by the sophisticated Greeks as a semi-barbaric backwater, was undergoing a dramatic transformation under the leadership of its ambitious young king, Philip II. Philip, who had spent time as a hostage in Thebes during its ascendancy, had observed firsthand the military innovations of Epaminondas. He had seen the power of a professional, well-trained army, and he understood the weaknesses inherent in the fragmented, often squabbling, Greek city-states. Philip's genius lay in his ability to combine military reform with astute diplomacy and relentless expansion. He revolutionized the Macedonian army, creating the formidable Macedonian phalanx, a deeper, more flexible formation armed with the sarissa, a terrifyingly long spear that could outreach any traditional hoplite spear. He integrated cavalry and siege engines more effectively than any previous Greek power. He understood that true power lay not just in brute force, but in economic strength and political maneuvering. He secured control of vital gold and silver mines, funding his ambitions, and skillfully played one Greek city-state against another, exploiting their rivalries and exhaustion. The shadow of Macedon lengthened over Greece, while Athens and Sparta continued their smaller-scale conflicts, often seeking alliances with or against each other. Philip was consolidating his power, conquering neighboring tribes, and slowly but surely expanding his influence southward. The Greeks, blinded by their historical rivalries and their ingrained belief in their own cultural superiority, initially underestimated him. Demosthenes, the brilliant Athenian orator, saw the danger clearly, delivering powerful speeches warning his countrymen about Philip's ambitions. But his warnings often fell on deaf ears, or were drowned out by those who advocated for peace or even alliance with Macedon. Sparta, in its diminished state, found itself increasingly isolated. They had lost their Peloponnesian allies, their economic base, and their military prestige. They clung to their traditions, their pride, but the world had moved on. They were no longer the arbiters of Greek destiny, but a fading power, struggling to maintain their independence in a landscape dominated by new forces. The once feared Spartan name still carried weight, but it was a weight of historical memory, not contemporary power. The final act of Greek independence, before the complete subjugation by Macedon, played out at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC. Here, Philip II, leading his Macedonian forces, decisively defeated a combined army of Athens and Thebes. It was a crushing victory that effectively ended the independence of the Greek city-states. Sparta, notably, was not present at Chaeronea. They had either chosen to remain neutral, or more likely, were simply too weak and isolated to contribute a meaningful force. Following Chaeronea, Philip convened the League of Corinth, ostensibly to unite the Greek states against Persia, but in reality to solidify his control over them. All the major Greek city-states were compelled to join, swearing an oath of allegiance to Philip as their hegemon. All, that is, except Sparta. When Philip sent an envoy to Sparta, demanding their submission, the Spartans famously replied with a single word: no. Philip, perhaps amused by their defiance, or more likely, recognizing that a direct confrontation with the remnants of Spartan pride was not worth the effort when they posed no real threat, chose to leave them alone. He reportedly sent a message: "If I come to Laconia, I will raze Sparta to the ground." The Spartan reply was equally terse: "If." This exchange, whether entirely factual or embellished by later historians, perfectly encapsulates Sparta's position in this new world. They retained their fierce independence, their unyielding pride, but it was a pride born of a glorious past, not present strength. They were a relic, a living museum of a bygone era, too proud to submit, but too weak to resist. The iron discipline that had once forged an empire, now merely preserved a fading memory. The once mighty Spartan lion, its teeth dulled and its roar a whisper, watched from the sidelines as the world it had once dominated moved inexorably forward, under the shadow of a new, far more powerful master. The age of the independent city-state was drawing to a close, and with it, the long, complex, and often brutal story of Sparta's rise and fall. The sun, once a fierce ally, now seemed to cast longer, cooler shadows across the Eurotas Valley. Sparta, the city of iron and discipline, found itself in an age where the very foundations of its power had shifted. The Hellenistic Age, born from the conquests of Alexander the Great, was a world of vast empires, cosmopolitan cities, and professional armies. The old Spartan ways, once the envy and terror of Greece, now seemed almost anachronistic, a relic from a bygone era. Yet, the spirit of Lycurgus, though tarnished, still flickered, and there were those who believed Sparta could rise again. After the crushing defeat at Leuctra in 371 BC and the subsequent liberation of Messenia, Sparta's economic and military might had been severely curtailed. The loss of Messenia, its fertile lands and its helot labour, was a wound that never truly healed. The number of full Spartan citizens, the homoioi, continued to dwindle, a demographic crisis that had been brewing for centuries. Land ownership became increasingly concentrated in fewer hands, leading to a growing disparity between the wealthy few and the impoverished many. This internal strife, a betrayal of the Lycurgan ideal of equality, further weakened the state from within. Despite this decline, Sparta was not entirely forgotten on the wider stage. Its name still carried a certain weight, a legacy of military prowess that even the new Hellenistic monarchs respected, if only as a historical curiosity. Spartan mercenaries, though fewer in number, still found employment in the armies of the Diadochi, the successors of Alexander, their distinctive discipline a valuable asset, even if their homeland could no longer field a dominant force. The 3rd century BC saw a series of Spartan kings and reformers who attempted to reverse the city's fortunes. One such figure was Arius I, who reigned from 309 to 265 BC. He was a king who understood that Sparta could not cling solely to its past. Arius was the first Spartan king to mint his own coins, a clear departure from the traditional Spartan disdain for wealth and currency. These coins, bearing his image and the emblem of a lion, were not just symbols of economic pragmatism. They were a statement of a more Hellenistic approach to power, one that embraced trade and diplomacy alongside military strength. Arius also sought to re-establish Sparta's influence through alliances, notably with the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt, a major power in the Hellenistic world. He even led a Spartan force against Antigonus Gonatas, the king of Macedon, in the Cremonidean War, 267 to 261 BC. Though this alliance ultimately failed to dislodge Macedonian dominance over Greece, his efforts, while not entirely successful, demonstrated a willingness to adapt, to engage with the new geopolitical realities. However, the most significant attempts at reform came later, in the mid-3rd century BC, with the reigns of Agis IV and Cleomenes III. These two kings, separated by a generation, shared a common vision: to restore Sparta to its former glory by reviving the Lycurgan constitution. They believed that the key to resurgence lay in addressing the land inequality and the dwindling citizen body. Agis IV, who ruled from 245 to 241 BC, was a young, idealistic king deeply troubled by the state of Sparta. He proposed radical reforms: the cancellation of debts, the redistribution of land, and the enrollment of new citizens from the perioikoi and even some deserving helots. His vision was to restore the homoioi to their original number and economic equality, thereby recreating the powerful citizen army of old. This was an audacious plan, directly challenging the vested interests of the wealthy Spartan elite who held most of the land. Unsurprisingly, his reforms met with fierce opposition. The ephors, the powerful elected magistrates, and the gerousia, the council of elders, largely represented the interests of the landed aristocracy. Despite some initial popular support, Agis' efforts were ultimately thwarted. He was eventually betrayed, arrested, and executed by his opponents. A tragic end for a king who sought to save Sparta by returning to its roots. His death highlighted the deep divisions within Spartan society and the formidable power of the conservative faction. The torch of reform was then picked up by Cleomenes III, who reigned from 235 to 222 BC. Cleomenes, the son of Leonidas II, who had been a staunch opponent of Agis, initially seemed to embody the conservative reaction. However, he gradually came to believe that Agis' diagnosis of Sparta's ills was correct, even if his methods had been flawed. Cleomenes was a more pragmatic and ruthless reformer than Agis. He understood that to enact change, he first needed to break the power of the opposition. In 227 BC, he launched a coup, purging the ephors and seizing absolute power. This was an unprecedented act for a Spartan king, a clear break from the traditional dual kingship and the checks and balances of the Lycurgan system. With the opposition neutralized, Cleomenes proceeded with his reforms, which were even more sweeping than those proposed by Agis. He abolished the ephorate, redistributed land, freed many helots, and even reintroduced aspects of the traditional Spartan education system, pedagogy, for all citizens. He sought to create a new, larger citizen body, capable of fielding a substantial army. For a brief period, Sparta seemed to experience a renaissance. Cleomenes led his revitalized army to impressive victories against the Achaean League, a powerful confederation of Greek city-states that had become the dominant force in the Peloponnese. He even managed to capture Argos and Corinth, extending Spartan influence once more. Historians still debate the true nature of Cleomenes' reforms. Was he a genuine Lycurgan idealist, seeking to restore the ancient constitution, or a Hellenistic monarch in the mold of Alexander's successors, using the rhetoric of tradition to consolidate his own power? His abolition of the ephorate and his autocratic rule certainly suggest a more monarchical ambition than a pure return to the Lycurgan system. Perhaps he was a blend of both. A king who believed that only through centralized power could Sparta be saved, even if it meant sacrificing some of its ancient customs. The resurgence under Cleomenes, however, was short-lived. The Achaean League, alarmed by Sparta's renewed power, appealed to Antigonus Doson, the king of Macedon. This marked a critical turning point. For centuries, Sparta had fiercely resisted Macedonian hegemony. Now, the Achaeans, once allies or rivals, invited the very power Sparta had fought to keep at bay. The resulting conflict, known as the Cleomenian War, 229 to 222 BC, pitted Cleomenes' reformed Sparta against the combined might of the Achaean League and Macedonian phalanxes. The decisive battle took place at Salacia in 222 BC, near the Spartan border. Cleomenes, despite his tactical skill and the bravery of his troops, was heavily outnumbered by the Macedonian Achaean forces. The Spartan army, though reinvigorated, could not withstand the disciplined Macedonian phalanx and its superior cavalry. The defeat was catastrophic. Most of the new Spartan citizen army was annihilated. Cleomenes himself fled to Egypt, seeking refuge with his Ptolemaic allies, but his attempts to raise a new army there ultimately failed, and he eventually took his own life. The defeat at Salacia effectively ended Sparta's last serious attempt at military and political resurgence. Macedonia, under Antigonus Doson, occupied Sparta, something no foreign power had done before. Although the Macedonians did not destroy the city, They dismantled Cleomenes' reforms, restored the ephorate, and imposed a more traditional, oligarchic government. The agoge was abolished, and Sparta became, in essence, a client state, its independence severely curtailed. From this point onward, Sparta's influence continued to wane. It became a minor player in the shifting alliances and conflicts of the Hellenistic world, often caught between the larger powers of Macedon, the Achaean League, and later, Rome. The city itself, once austere and forbidding, began to acquire a more Hellenistic character. The old Lycurgan laws against luxury were increasingly ignored. The theatre and the gymnasium, once secondary to military training, gained prominence. Wealthy citizens built more elaborate homes, and public buildings began to reflect the architectural trends of the wider Hellenistic world. The harsh discipline that had defined Sparta for centuries softened, replaced by a more relaxed, if still distinctly Spartan, way of life. The final chapter of Sparta's independence came with the rise of Rome. As the Roman Republic expanded its influence eastward, it inevitably clashed with the Hellenistic kingdoms and leagues. Sparta, by this time, was a shadow of its former self, a picturesque relic rather than a formidable power. When the Achaean League finally confronted Rome in the Achaean War, 146 BC, Sparta sided with Rome, hoping to regain some autonomy or favour. However, the Roman victory at the Battle of Corinth in 146 BC marked the end of Greek independence. Greece became a Roman province, and Sparta, along with all other Greek cities, was absorbed into the vast Roman Empire. Under Roman rule, Sparta was granted a degree of autonomy as a free city, largely due to its historical reputation and its alignment with Rome. It became a popular destination for Roman tourists and intellectuals, eager to witness the remnants of its legendary past. The agoge, though no longer mandatory for military purposes, was revived as a cultural spectacle, a sort of living museum of ancient Spartan customs. Wealthy Romans would travel to Laconia to see young boys enduring the traditional Spartan training, a curious blend of historical reenactment and genuine athletic pursuit. The city, once defined by its strict adherence to Lycurgan law, now thrived on the very fame of that law, becoming a tourist attraction, a testament to a bygone era. The iron discipline had rusted away, the stern faces of its warriors replaced by the curious gazes of visitors. The whispers of the Eurotas still carried echoes of ancient commands, of shields clashing and spears thrusting, but they were now distant, fading sounds. Sparta, the unconquered, the unique, had finally succumbed not to a single overwhelming force, but to the slow, inexorable tide of time and the changing currents of history. Its legacy, however, would endure, a powerful myth woven into the fabric of Western thought, a testament to a society that dared to live by a code unlike any other. The sun, setting over the Taygetus Mountains, still painted the valley in hues of gold and purple, but the Spartan light, once so brilliant, had dimmed to a gentle, lingering glow. The gentle rhythm of the Eurotas, which had witnessed so many generations of Spartan life, continued its slow journey to the sea, even as the world around it shifted dramatically. The Macedonian dominance, though significant, was but a prelude to an even greater power rising in the west, Rome. The shadow of the burgeoning Roman Republic began to stretch across the Mediterranean, and its influence, initially subtle, soon became undeniable. By the 3rd century BCE, Rome had consolidated its power in Italy and was looking eastward. Its first major engagement with the Greek world came during the First Macedonian War, from 214 to 205 BCE, though Sparta's direct involvement was minimal at this stage. However, the shifting alliances and the growing presence of Roman legions in the region signaled a new era. The Achaean League, which had long sought to unite the Peloponnese, found itself increasingly caught between the ambitions of Macedon and the rising power of Rome. Sparta, ever fiercely independent, continued its own path, often clashing with the Achaean League, particularly under the leadership of Philopoemen, the last of the Greeks, who sought to bring all Peloponnesian states under the League's banner. One of the most significant confrontations of this period for Sparta was the Lycurgan War, 195 BCE. Nabis, a Spartan ruler who had seized power and attempted to restore some of Sparta's former glory through radical social reforms, including the liberation of helots and the redistribution of land, found himself facing a formidable coalition. The Achaean League, allied with Rome and other Greek states like Rhodes and Pergamum, launched a concerted attack. The Roman general Flamininus, fresh from his victory over Philip V of Macedon at Cynoscephali, led the Roman contingent. Despite Nabis's desperate resistance and the construction of new fortifications around Sparta, the city eventually fell to the allied forces. Nabis was forced to relinquish his coastal territories, and Sparta was compelled to join the Achaean League, marking a significant loss of its traditional autonomy. This was a bitter pill for a state that had prided itself on its independence for centuries, a moment when the ancient foundations of its unique existence began to truly crumble under external pressure. The period that followed was one of uneasy peace and simmering tensions. Sparta, though nominally part of the Achaean League, chafed under its authority. Disputes over boundaries, legal jurisdiction, and the very definition of Spartan autonomy frequently erupted, leading to further interventions by Rome. The Romans, with their pragmatic approach to governance, often preferred to maintain a balance of power, playing various Greek states against each other to prevent any single entity from becoming too powerful. This policy, while seemingly maintaining peace, also subtly eroded the independence of each state, drawing them deeper into Rome's orbit. The final act of Greek independence and Sparta's absorption into the Roman world came with the Achaean War, 146 BCE. The Achaean League, fueled by a resurgence of nationalistic fervour and a desperate desire to throw off Roman influence, directly challenged Rome. Sparta, still resentful of its forced inclusion in the League and its diminished status, actually sided with Rome during this conflict, hoping to regain some of its lost prestige and autonomy. However, the outcome was inevitable. The Roman general Lucius Mummius decisively defeated the Achaean forces at the Battle of Corinth, leading to the sacking of the city and the dissolution of the Achaean League. This marked the definitive end of Greek political independence. With the Achaean War's conclusion, Greece was formally absorbed into the Roman Republic, becoming the Roman province of Achaia. Sparta, though it had aligned with Rome, did not escape the general subjugation. It was granted the status of a free city within the province, which meant it retained local self-governance and its traditional laws, but it was ultimately subject to Roman authority and paid tribute. This was a far cry from its former glory, a shadow of the independent, dominant power of the Peloponnese. The dual kingship, the Gerousia, the Ephors, these institutions continued, but their power was now largely ceremonial, operating within the framework of Roman imperial control. Life in Roman Sparta, while perhaps less dramatic than its classical heyday, continued. The city became a popular tourist destination for wealthy Romans, eager to experience the legendary austerity and unique customs of the Spartans. They came to see the Syssitia, the agoge, and the ancient training grounds, often romanticizing a past that was already fading. Spartan festivals and athletic contests continued, though often with a Roman flavor. The city even saw a minor revival of its educational institutions, attracting students interested in philosophy and rhetoric, though the military focus of the classical agoge was largely gone. The Lycurgan laws, once the bedrock of Spartan society, were now more of a historical curiosity, a set of ancient traditions maintained for their novelty rather than their practical application in a world governed by Roman law. Historians still debate the extent to which Sparta genuinely preserved its unique identity under Roman rule. Some argue that the city became little more than a living museum, a theme park of its former self, its distinctive institutions hollowed out and maintained primarily for Roman consumption. Others contend that despite the loss of political independence, the Spartans managed to retain a core sense of their cultural heritage, adapting their traditions to survive within the Roman system. Perhaps the most enduring aspect was the laconophilia that permeated Roman thought, the admiration for Spartan simplicity, discipline, and courage, even if it was often based on an idealized and somewhat mythical understanding of their history. Roman writers like Plutarch, who himself lived much later, would extensively document Spartan lives and customs, further cementing this idealized image in the Western consciousness. The physical landscape of Sparta also changed. Roman-style buildings, including a theatre and a forum, were constructed, blending with the older, more modest Spartan structures. The Acropolis, once the heart of its religious and military life, continued to house temples, but the city itself sprawled more like a typical Roman town. The famous unfortified nature of classical Sparta gave way to some defensive structures, a testament to the changing nature of warfare and the need for protection even under the Pax Romana. As the centuries passed, Sparta, like the rest of Greece, became an integral part of the vast Roman Empire. When the empire split in 395 CE, Greece, including Sparta, fell under the Eastern Roman Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire. The city continued to exist, though its prominence waned further. The ancient traditions, once so fiercely guarded, gradually faded into memory, replaced by the evolving customs and religious practices of the Byzantine era, particularly the spread of Christianity. The last vestiges of the classical Spartan way of life disappeared as the world moved into the early medieval period. Yet the echo of Sparta, its unique social experiment, its unwavering discipline, and its fierce dedication to a collective ideal, resonated far beyond its physical demise. The very concept of Spartan became synonymous with austerity, resilience, and courage, a legacy that transcended the ruins of its ancient walls. Its story, a tapestry woven with threads of iron will and communal sacrifice, continued to inspire, provoke thought, and serve as a powerful counterpoint to other models of human society. The Eurotas flowed on, carrying with it the silent stories of a civilization that dared to be different, a testament to the enduring power of an idea, even as its physical manifestation returned to the dust.